In 2004, Swedish writer John Ashby Lengvist, hopefully spelled correctly, surprised the world of fiction with his gothic modern-day horror debut novel Let the Right One In, that tells the story of Oscar, a young, lonely, and bullied boy who meets a peculiar girl named Ellie, while obscure and violent things begin to happen in his hometown, leading to him finding out Ellie is a vampire. The novel was so successful and beloved that in 2008 a film adaptation was made directed by Thomas Alfredson to great results. The film depicted very interesting characters in a subtle, realistic, and sometimes symbolic way. It had the atmosphere, pacing, and tone of a well-made horror movie, and on top of that it showed a touching story with a believable romantic feeling, making for a very refreshing and highly enjoyable experience. So of course, like it usually happens whenever a non-American film is successful and well-made, Hollywood producers decided to make a remake to present the story to American audiences in order to make money off both horror-loving audiences and fans of the first adaptation alike. The good news is that they gave the project to Matt Reeves, director of very decent movies like Cloverfield and some of the modern Planet of the Apes movies. Matt Reeves clearly cared for the movie and had respect for the source material. He even read the novel and crafted some of the script from it. So technically speaking, the American version titled Let Me In, for some reason, is not just another remake milking money off a popular property, but another adaptation made by talented people. Honestly, when I heard of the remake, I had very little hopes for it. The original Swedish version blew me away when I first saw it a couple of years ago, and given how 90% of Hollywood's remakes and reboots have been consistently giant pieces of shit cash grabs of foreign wonders, I wasn't very enthusiastic when I started watching this one. Luckily for me, I was wrong. That makes me wonder then, which of these two movies is the superior version, the Swedish or the American one? Both versions have things I like, things that make them memorable, stuff that I must complain about as a critic, and both have things that I actually hate. So this is not just a video of an angry critic ranting over a bad remake, this is a honest analysis with the objective of finding out which is the best movie, Let the Right One In or Let Me In. Like many adaptations with multiple versions, both movies tell the exact same story, but they also try to be creative with how the story is told with the structure and writing of major scenes and characters. These two movies are a good example. They both show Oscar, named Owen in the American version, as a young kid who's going through hard times. He has to deal with the separation of his parents, an alcoholic father, the distance between him and his mother, and the fact that he's introverted and shy makes him a target for school bullies. His personality and problems are told visually. You have to pay attention to the actors' actions and read their expressions so you can understand how they feel, so you can understand his loneliness and sadness. Whenever the movie has to address the supernatural elements, it never has to recur to unnecessary exposition, so it can stay focused on the important stuff. The writing and acting is always quite fantastic. It never felt fake or unnatural. Okay, so both movies do a very competent job at telling a story, but if that's the case, what makes the movie different from the other? After all, there is no point in making another movie, you just make everything the same, right? In order to do my job easier for myself, I have classified what I consider the most important aspects of these movies in sections so I can compare them, carefully pointing out what they did right and what they did poorly. Starting with number 1, the look. Both movies are shot beautifully. There are a lot of interesting and creative shots with nice looking angles that do a wonderful job telling the story visually. Even when the characters are simply sitting in a room and talking, the cinematography keeps the overall look of the scene rich and interesting. There is literally not a single scene in either movie that feels unnecessary, boring, or out of place in terms of scene composition. Turns out both movies had excellent cinematographers. Let Me In had Greg Fraser, who was in charge of a bunch of movies with fantastic visuals: Foxcatcher, Star Wars Rogue One, Lion, It's no surprise the American version is so refreshing to look at. Let the Right One In had Hoyt van Hoytema, hopefully spelled properly. This man is a fucking genius. He made some of the best looking movies of this generation. Her, Interstellar, fucking Dunkirk. So there isn't much to criticize in terms of cinematography. Both movies clearly had very talented people that truly cared about what they were doing. While I admit I like the visual style in the Swedish version more for reasons I'll explain later, I think both versions are at the same level of competence. Number 2. CGI. Okay, I already established that I like both movies. I just prized the hell out of the cinematography. I said the acting is and stays consistently good. That being said, the CGI in these movies is fucking terrible. Now, even though I can appreciate a good movie with no CGI whatsoever, I'm not anti-CGI. There are tons of movies that perfectly incorporate computer-made effects without the viewer ever caring or even noticing when the CGI is on screen. But when the CGI is so obvious, bad-looking, and it's so unbelievably fake that it makes you wonder why they didn't craft a different scene instead, the entire scene is ruined. In Let the Right One In, there are a couple of passable effects, but this sequence of a middle-aged lady who was just bitten by a vampire and transformed into another one entering a place filled with cats, it's absolutely awful. Thankfully, it's the only scene in the movie that took me out of it. Let Me In sadly has many terrible moments that are destroyed by dollar store quality CGI. And unfortunately for this version, the scenes I'm talking about are some of the most important parts of the film. I can understand in the Swedish version they use CGI in this scene because it will be very difficult to make the cats do that, plus it will also be very cruel for animals. And therefore they opted for these bad effects, because it's impossible to create this entire sequence unless you use CGI. But in the American version it feels the other way around. Like they wanted to create this scene like this without realizing the overuse of CGI makes it look so bad. Let's compare scenes from both movies. In the original, Ellie attacks a woman from above a tree. It's a very simple scene that begins and ends very quickly. American version, unnecessary CGI. Later on, she bites another man in self-defense. You don't see much of the attack, because what is happening is very obvious and they want to keep Ellie's vampire form a mystery. American version, unnecessary CGI. In an early scene, Ellie is starving for blood, lures a pedestrian and then bites him. It's another quick scene that needs no digital effects. American version, unnecessary dollar store CGI. Look at this atrocity. Let Me In had almost 5 times the budget of the original movie, and they give us this PlayStation 1 graphics. And it's not just a frame or two, they struggle for a while. In fact, I could make an entire section explaining how bad this scene is. But I'm gonna save it for later. In conclusion, even though the CGI in both movies is awful, the Swedish version used them much less frequently, and more importantly, knew when not to use them at all. Number 3. The supporting cast. Before I mentioned how the American version had its fair share of elements that make it enjoyable and also different from the original movie, right? Well, that different, enjoyable experience lies on the supporting characters. Some of them are different, some of their roles were shortened or replaced by someone else, or have even more screen time and development than in the original. And almost all of the new scenes and character arcs work smoothly, so I'm going to mention them from the ones I like the less to the ones that actually impressed me. The bullies. Mental and physical abuse is an important part of Oscar's character. His dysfunctional family has made him grow up into a shy and introverted kid, and this also made him an easy target for school bullies. While in most movies bullying is poorly portrayed and made as an excuse to make the characters violent or vengeful for no reason, like in that piece of trash movie I reviewed some time ago. It starts with aggressive humiliation and slowly degenerates into displays of violence. It feels up close and personal. I really fucking hate how in most American movies they hire older actors to portray kids. It just shows how lazy they were during casting to just look for younger actors. What? Oh. Turns out Cody Smith McPhee is actually older than Dylan Minnette. Okay, so there's nothing else to complain. The acting is very solid and they actually made different scenes with almost the same impact. Moving on. The parents. While you can hear her voice, Oscar's mother is barely on screen, and when she is only for a couple of seconds. This was done to represent how Oscar has been slowly distanciating himself from her to the point she cannot understand him. In the American version, they use the same concept, but with a different approach. Now Owen's mother has a little more dialogue, but whenever she's on screen, her face is almost always out of focus. Again, to symbolize how she becomes a distant and alien figure. Then there is the father. In the Swedish version, Oscar still visits his father because he loves him, but as time goes on, Oscar realizes his father is in fact an alcoholic. The movie never verbally specifies it. Instead, there is this subtle scene that shows him and his drunk friends scare him. So he no longer feels like visiting him, making him even more lonely and realizing Ellie is the only one he feels comfortable with. In the American version, it's clear from the beginning Owen's father is alcoholic, but surprisingly he's never on screen. You only hear his voice over the phone. When Owen discovers Abby is a vampire and she has killed many of his neighbors, he calls him and simply asks if someone can be truly evil.
Do you think there's such a thing as evil?
What? What are you talking about, man?
Can people be evil?
So, where are you getting all this stuff? Is this from your mother? All her religious crap?
No.
You know what? Oh, listen, put your mother on the phone, okay? I want to talk to her.
I was very impressed by this scene. I think the dialogue and acting are pretty on point, and the whole scene serves to show how Owen loses the trust in his father, and his only friend now is Abby. Like I said before, the parents always have the same character and purpose, but more importantly, both movies manage to portray them and incorporate them into the story in different and memorable ways. The couple and the policeman. In the original movie, there's this little soft plot that briefly follows a middle-aged couple that lives in the same vicinity as Oscar. Ellie's first victim just happened to be one of their friends. When she attacks him, one of the neighbors sees what's going on from far away. Okay, now he knows there is a vampire in the neighborhood, but no one believes him, so he tries to convince others about what he saw because he is afraid of it and also wants to catch his friend's killer. Later on, the wife of the couple leaves the house and she becomes Ellie's next victim, but the husband interrupts her, saving the life of his wife. This makes for a very sad scene in which we see her desperately trying to find blood to survive. Then the scene with the CGI cats takes place. Then she's taken to the hospital and feeling she now has become another vampire and her life is over, asks the nurse to open the window so the sunlight vanquishes her. Later on, the husband tries to find the vampire in Ellie's department and is also attacked by her. The entire thing is a simple but very effective subplot that serves to show to the audience how dangerous Ellie really is. It makes you take the fact that she's a vampire seriously. There are stakes. If Ellie wants to survive, a human has to die. It's a major plot point. It destroys the lives of 3 innocent people. Now in the American version, the couple has much less relevance. Owen spies on the woman in the beginning of the film, maybe to show he has awakened his interest in the opposite sex, which might explain why he was interested in Abby in the first place. The first victim is a jogger. He's attacked in the awful scene I mentioned before. There is no witness this time. Again, the wife is the second victim, but this time she seems to be taken over by her instinct and is killed accidentally by the sunlight. So instead of making the couple in the movie the sympathetic victims, they focus on a new character, a policeman, who seems like a nice man that truly wants to help others and understand what's going on.
Are you a Satanist? Are you involved in some kind of cult? Because if there's others involved, we'll get them. We'll find them, believe me.
I for one like this change because even though the only thing that changes is the third victim, it does make sense that the police will be investigating the murders committed by Ellie, or Abby, and Hakan. Speaking of which... Hakan, hopefully spelled properly. Hakan is the middle-aged man who accompanies Ellie. In the beginning we see him knocking out a young man, hanging him upside down, and then draining his blood into a container. And then when it's more than obvious Ellie is a vampire, you can connect the pieces together. Hakan is collecting blood for Ellie to drink. They constantly change location to avoid the authorities, and this town is just one of the temporary stops. Now Hakan is actually a very tragic character. At first glance he seems like a cold-hearted serial killer, especially because you don't know why he's hunting people down. But once you see that he clearly takes no enjoyment in what he does and is only doing it to help Ellie survive, it's much easier to sympathize with him, even if it's clear that what he does is a terrible crime. And the actors do a wonderful job demonstrating there is a strong bond of friendship or even love between them, if we consider Ellie hasn't aged and therefore only has the appearance of a child. When he fails another of his blood-stealing attempts, he pours acid on his own face, most likely to avoid being recognized after dying. It's especially heartbreaking when Ellie finds out that he survived and was taken to a hospital. Then she visits him, and in a quiet and touching scene you see what remains of him. Now that he understands that he'll be catched, that he'll be linked to the other murders, and all that awaits him is a prison, or life on the run with a deformed face, he gives his blood to Ellie and then decides to end his own life. In the American adaptation, Hakan is only referred as Abby's father, precisely because he poses as such, but his proper name is never revealed. We also have the great performance of Richard Jenkins. Despite having little screen time and limited dialogue, he delivered my favorite performance probably. It's no surprise Jenkins is being slowly more recognized over time. Hell, he was just nominated for an Oscar for his performance in Shape of Water. This version of the character is precisely what I want in a remake. He essentially is the same character, but the actor and his different dialogue make him feel less predictable. Important scenes like the one in the hospital are basically shot-for-shot recreations, but then completely new scenes were written especially for him, like this semi-long sequence that completely blew me away. First we see him entering his target's car like he usually does, but this time another person also gets in, and from there the scene becomes a suspenseful and unpredictable moment that makes you constantly wonder if he will succeed or will be found out, culminating in a jaw-dropping shot of him trying to steal the car but crashing down a hill and then attempting to kill himself. I love how they portray this character's arc, as if it was a simple matter of time. His method was imperfect and his fall was a mathematical possibility. The bad CGI that characterized many scenes with Abby is nowhere to be seen, and instead we see a good sequence with top-notch camera work and pacing. So I believe when it comes to all the secondary characters, both movies made a very good job when introducing characters that serve a purpose, and their involvement slowly concludes in an important part of the story. Oscar/Owen. I already talked about how the main character is an introverted and shy kid, victim of bullying, and is going through rough times due to the separation of his parents. In my opinion, both actors did a great job playing the part. Their mannerisms and body language alone are enough to make them come across as a silent person with no experience in communication or interaction with the opposite gender. When they meet Ellie, or Abby, you can tell they feel attracted to her right away. Maybe because vampires naturally attract humans, or simply because the protagonist is starting to be interested in women. Either way, it is portrayed very naturally. After getting to know each other better, she encourages him to defend himself. And I think this is why I like Oscar slightly more than Owen. When he finally hits the bully's back, he almost smiles out of satisfaction, as if convinced that his life is finally changing for the better. And from that point on, he feels more confident and mature. The actor gives the character body language that makes him feel a bit different, but not changed entirely. The subsequent scenes featuring him and Ellie even make him look as he's constantly trying to impress her. He seems so convinced that they are dating, that he's losing his shyness. Owen, on the other hand, always seems like the same kid, and maybe that was the intention, but at least for me, Oscar's character arc was much more satisfying. Just a different take on the character. One of them performs an act of bravery and takes it as necessary self-defense, while the other takes it as a triumph over his own fear. Ellie and Abby. Ellie is a 12-year-old girl who moves to the same neighborhood Oscar lives in. As we already know, she's actually a vampire with a mysterious past and identity. Despite her appearance, her true age is unknown. Now, because all the stuff I mentioned about her, she might seem like an evil presence in the film, but as the story progresses, we find out only the opposite is true. When Hakan was just done draining another person's blood, he accidentally lost the flask, so there was nothing for Ellie to drink. That's why she goes outside during the night, lures a man while pretending to be hurt, and then attacks. Remember how I told you about this scene in the remake and how I could spend a lot of time telling you why it doesn't work? Well, it's time to explain why it doesn't work. And fear not, I realize how much I've been pestering you about CGI, so I'm not even going to use it as an argument anymore. Ready? Here we go. First off, why are we hearing this typical horror music? Which is very generic, by the way. If you actually want this scene to be suspenseful, you should have left it quiet. Still, why? Just why did they make Abby look like a spider monkey? Is that supposed to point out she's a vampire? Since when vampires move like that? In the original film, Ellie simply overcomes the man during the struggle. That more than clearly tells you she's much stronger than any human. That was enough. You don't need to give her these ridiculous unnatural spasms. Again, ignoring the CGI completely, how am I supposed to take this scene seriously? The greatest problem, however, is what happens by the end. When Abby is done drinking, she looks up while showing off a monstrous face. But why? Why will she look at that direction if there's no one there? Why at this point is she acting like a beast if there is no reason to? Is the director actually trying to scare the audience? With this? Chloe Grace Moretz ain't scary or intimidating. In fact, this is the equivalent of a child dressing up as a monster and then genuinely trying to scare you. It's embarrassing. Take a look at the original film. After biting the man, Ellie quietly and slowly sees what she has done for a moment and then breaks down. She takes no pride or enjoyment in killing humans. She does it because otherwise she will starve. That's why she finished him off. Otherwise he will have transformed into a vampire and will have gone through the same as the middle-aged lady. In that occasion, Ellie simply didn't have enough time to finish her off. She's not evil, she's just very dangerous. The subtlety in the scene basically tells us that she appreciates life and knows the gravity of committing murder. That's why she's genuinely sad in the scene. This is how you do character development without any kind of exposition whatsoever. Chloe Grace Moretz is a perfectly good actress and I think she gave a fine performance, but I just never bought her as a vampire, at least not as much as Lina Linderson. She has this pale skin and these huge eye bags that make her look almost undead, and when she reveals what she is to Oscar, her appearance is simply changed to that of an older woman, because her true age might be several centuries. When she attacks with murderous intentions, her entire body is almost always off camera, leaving her appearance in that moment to the viewer's imagination. I think that was much more clever than simply shooting her scenes in the same fashion as a cheap and gory horror film. Also, when the bullies call the older brother and he's basically drowning Oscar, one of them regrets what he's doing and is frightened because he thinks Oscar will die. So Ellie shows up and dismembers them. Again, she's not visible and you can only see Oscar underwater while the massacre happens. But once Oscar is safe, we see that the boy who was frightened was not harmed. It's little details like this that visually tell you Ellie doesn't kill for pleasure, but out of necessity. In the remake, Abby's a killing machine. Even when Owen is out of the water, you can hear Abby's rageful screams, and shortly after everyone is dead, the place is a mixture of guts and blood. I think by this point it's pretty obvious which characters I prefer, but I still have to point out how the scenes that involve Owen and Abby actually interacting and bonding are almost a shot-for-shot recreation of the scenes in the original version. I prized how they created completely new scenes for the secondary characters as well as surprisingly great sequences for characters like Hakan. But it seems Matt Reeves either ran out of time while writing the script for this adaptation, or he liked the original scenes so much that he decided to recreate them in the exact same way. And while he succeeded, I think he missed a great opportunity to make his own interpretation of these characters, make his own take on how they will slowly become friends, and then start the parasitic relationship that Ellie had with Hakan, but that also kind of feels like love. This is a remake, so you had a great chance of giving the character development a different approach. You certainly did so with minor characters. The slightly different scene I remember involves Owen showing Abby an arcade, but that scene only serves as a reminder of the movie taking place in the 80s and holds very little relevance. Finally, I think the best way to end this discussion is to mention the aspects of Let the Right One In that impressed me so much that the movie became one of my favorite vampire films, right next to the Nosferatu remake and Chan-wook Park's Thirst, and that is the details. Remember how at the beginning I said I preferred the overall look and cinematography of the original version? Well, that's because the movie's color creates a great atmosphere. The remake always has some very good moody lighting, but they constantly combine the warm colors with the cold ones. Some light sources even have color. The original film constantly has these pale and cold colors in almost every scene, so whenever blood appears on screen it seems much more relevant and it stands out much more when it combines with the rest of the scenery. And if you are perceptive enough, you will notice that most scenes in the film actually have a red-colored object shown prominently or appearing slowly as the scene goes on. I believe director Thomas Alfredson wanted to symbolize how Oscar's world is this cold, cruel and lonely world, and then an anomaly enters it that, despite the violent implications, has given him the warmth he needed. The red color represents the anomaly, and that anomaly is Ellie. Speaking of her, there is a line that is also in the remake of Ellie telling Oscar that she's not a girl, him asking what is she then, and she replying, "I'm nothing."
I'm not a girl. You're not a girl? No. What are you? I'm nothing. Oh.
In a later scene, Ellie's changing clothes. Oscar spies for a second and sees that she has no genitals. I can't show it to you, but it kinda looks like this, as if she was mutilated. Turns out Ellie is actually a boy. In the Swedish film, this is only shown, but in the novel it's explained that his genitals were mutilated when he was transformed into a vampire. Lina Linders's voice was even dubbed by a voice actress named Elif Seeland to make Ellie sound androgynous. Why is this so important? Because it makes the romance between the characters feel more authentic. When Oscar discovers Ellie may be a he, it doesn't even seem to bother him.
Oscar, jag är ingen flicka.
Nej. Har jag chans på dig eller?
When Ellie is showing him the apartment and his possessions, there is a scene that shows a fistful of what seem to be wedding rings, which might indicate many other companions of Ellie proposed to him through the many ages he's been alive. Lastly, there is this wonderful scene in which Oscar has just recently discovered Ellie drinks blood and confronts him about it. Ellie closing the door and then answering his question is symbolizing how Oscar might or might not decide to enter in his life. Look at the title of the movie, Let the Right One In. It's not just a reference to how a vampire must be invited into the room to enter it, according to the film's logic. It's referencing how each character is slowly deciding to enter into each other's world. All of these details combined make the ending shot feel 100% natural and convincing. Oscar is in a train because he most likely left everything behind and has left the town with Ellie. In the end, while I think Let the Right One In is the superior film, I must say again that I think the American version, Let Me In, is also a damn good movie with little to complain about. It was a pleasure to me to dissect a movie I love so much and finding out again what I think makes it great. For your attention and time, my gratitude. Farewell.